Changed up here with another Savvy Sightseer video vacation. Portugal, beyond Lisbon and through the ages. It's the newest addition to the European destination travelogues, and the first European destination I've been able to visit since COVID started. Although a relatively small country, you can drive from Portugal's northern border with Spain to its southernmost region in only about 6.5 hours, or from the Atlantic shore east to Spain in about an hour and a half. It is, nonetheless, jam packed with not to miss marvels. Awash in World Heritage sites, sun bleached beaches, lush farms and vineyards, sweeping river views, and busy urban centers. Cosmopolitan Portugal has a little something for every traveler. Here, modern sophistication rubs elbows with historic traditions. Mainland Europe's westernmost country has oodles of opportunities to experience a culture and country of contradictions. It's no wonder Portugal now ranks among the top 5 countries that U.S. expats favor and has been named Best Tourist Destination in Europe. If you are looking to explore the capital city, Lisbon, that's been saved for a program all its own. Lisbon Bustling Beauty. Come along now as we venture through the country's central and northern regions, highlighted on this map. We'll stop at Évora, about 80 miles east of Lisbon, and unearth the secrets of cork production. We'll also pop into Porto, about 200 miles north of Lisbon, where the singular port wine is acclaimed and fictional Harry Potter is revered. There's a stop at Fatima, where peasant children gained world fame when they were visited by the Virgin Mary. And a look at the Douro Valley, with its thousands of acres of terraced vineyards and winding river. We'll even step back to medieval times at Óbidos and Tomar, where the striking Knights Templar complex looms on a hill. And that's just to whet your appetite for more stops on this wide-reaching visit to Portugal. One of the top destinations in Portugal for expats is the so-called Silver Coast, named for its pristine sandy beaches and how the sun shimmers on the waves coming off the Atlantic Ocean. Spanning more than 90 miles, the region is often referred to as the real Portugal by visitors. An easy day trip to the capital city, but a world away, the coastal region is populated by quaint towns reflecting a rich heritage covering many centuries. Nazaré stands out with its especially stunning and natural coastline, which lures master surfers from as far away as Hawaii, with 50-foot waves typically barreling in. On a really good winter day, it is reported they could get as high as 80 to 100 feet. The Guinness Book of Records documents 5 record-beating surfers at Nazaré since 2011. The latest, in 2020, by a German-born surfer who rode in one at 85 feet. A geological phenomena called the Nazaré Canyon is responsible for the world's biggest waves. Here, the largest underwater canyon in Europe, about 106 miles long and 3 miles deep along the coast, creates perfect giant breakers. Long before the town became a mecca for surfers and tourism in the 1960s, life here revolved around the sea in a different way. Nazaré was once the country's biggest fishing community. While there's less dependence on trawling for the current generation, an open-air dried fish museum on the beach keeps the heritage alive, demonstrating centuries-old traditions for sun-drying fish. Typically, the work of laying out the fish on racks was the role of the fishermen's wives. Among local catches, you'll find mackerel, barnacles, which is considered a local delicacy, sardines, which are very popular, especially grilled, dogfish, skate, octopus, snapper, sea bream, eel, and monkfish. You can't get much fresher than buying directly from the fishermen on the beach. Also at the shore are colorful traditional fishing boats, like those that once brought the catch of the day into town. Placards explain their history and show them as they were when the fishermen were hard at work on the open water. More modern boats, less adorable and colorful, have largely replaced these. The ocean's importance to this community, as well as for all Portuguese, is reflected in the walkway adjacent to the beach. The wavy pattern of black and white limestone cubes, known as Portuguese paving, is found the country over, usually depicting some image related to the sea. Some traditions are not relegated to museums, but are still actively a part of daily life. Around town, women can occasionally be spotted wearing the traditional dress of 7 petticoats. Various reasons for the colorful layers of skirts include simply keeping warm waiting on the beach for their men to bring in the haul for them to process. Others say they are a representation of the 7 virtues, or the days of the week, colors of the rainbow, or the 7 seas. Portugal has a complicated relationship with organized Christian religion, which started with the arrival of Romans in the 3rd century BC. Under Moorish rule in the 8th century, Christianity was pretty much wiped out, but the Moors were ousted in the 12th century, leading the way for devout Catholic Alfonso Enrique to become the first king of the newly formed nation state, and Christianity was restored then. He secured the Pope's support and rewarded the church with land and privilege for helping him expel the Moors. The church was then pretty much on a par in terms of power with the nobility, military, and even nearly the crown. In the 15th century, all Jews were evicted, and in the 16th, the Portuguese Inquisition started. Among the Catholic orders in the country at the time were Benedictines, Cistercians, Jesuits, and Carmelites. Intolerance for non-Christians prevailed, and the Jesuits were put in charge of education. But in the 18th century, anti-church sentiment grew. Some even blamed the brutal Inquisition practices for causing a devastating 1755 earthquake that mostly leveled the capital, Lisbon. They contended the tragedy was some type of divine retribution. By 1759, after a suspected attempted coup by Jesuits, King Joseph I expelled them too, broke with Rome, and turned education over to the state. The church lost both power and property. In 1910, an edict formally severing church from state was enacted. But in 1932, dictator Antonio Salazar, a very religious man who had attended the seminary for a while, came into power and soon reversed many of the anti-church policies. After he was ousted in the 1970s, a new constitution provided for religious freedoms. Although a large majority of Portuguese today identify as Catholic, most say they aren't actively practicing. Evidence of the days when the church was central, though, remain throughout the country, and Portugal is definitely a destination for admirers of old cathedrals. Some of the more prominent reminders of the Christian influence are in Alcobaça, Fatima, and Tumar. This one, the monastery of Santa Maria at Alcobaça, was founded by Alfonso I in the 12th century. The UNESCO World Heritage Site, about 75 miles north of Lisbon, is considered a masterpiece of Gothic art. Consecrated in 1252, the monastery church was the first Portuguese Gothic religious building. It became a cultural center and one of the most powerful Cistercian abbeys. While many will stop at Alcobaça to see the country's largest church, meticulously maintained, others come to check out its elaborate tombs and what arguably represents one of the oddest takes on a Romeo and Juliet type love story. The star-crossed lovers met in 1340 when future King Pedro wed Constance of Castile, or Spain, in a politically arranged marriage. But he immediately fell in love with her cousin and lady-in-waiting, Inez. Worried the infatuation would endanger Portugal's relations with the Kingdom of Castile, Pedro's father eventually expelled Inez from the court. The two, of course, found clandestine ways to keep their love alive until Constance passed away in childbirth in 1345. Defying his father, Pedro brought Inez back to the court, set up house together in nearby Coimbra, and had 4 children. The king was, to say the least, not happy, and so he had Inez executed. And now for the really weird part. Pedro claimed they had been secretly married for 7 years. When he ascended the throne in 1357, he had Inez's body exhumed and brought to Alcabasa, where he dressed her in a royal purple cloak and seated her on the throne of Portugal, forcing the entire court to come and kiss her hem, although more gruesome versions of the story say it was her decaying hand they had to kiss. Pedro commissioned these exquisitely carved tombs, which have been placed opposite each other on either side of the church's central aisle near the altar. According to a legend, the doomed lovers will then be able to immediately look into each other's eyes when they wake up for the Last Judgment. Operas, art, and even movies have been made about the sordid tale. Perhaps the most famous religious site in Portugal is Fatima, about 80 miles north of Lisbon. Many may have heard of the wonders that occurred here back in 1917, possibly by seeing the 1952 film The Miracle of Our Lady of Fatima, which ran annually on TV in the 1960s. Or maybe more recently with the 2020 movie remake simply titled Fatima. This grand basilica and a giant 160,000 square foot esplanade complex belie the simple setting where reportedly 3 children, ages 6 to 9, were tending their sheep on the hilly countryside when a vision appeared in an oak tree and spoke to the oldest girl, Lucia, on the 13th of May. In the middle of World War I, and not long after the edict separating church and state went into effect in Portugal, the children's tale of the beautiful lady from heaven asking for people to pray for peace was not immediately embraced. In that anti-clerical time, Lucia and her cousins Francisco and Jacinta faced strong pushback from authorities and were even imprisoned for a short time. But they remained strong in their belief and the mission they were given in the form of 3 messages from the vision. Peace would come if people would pray the rosary. Another and more terrible war would begin if men didn't stop offending God. And there would be an attempt to murder a bishop dressed in white. Essentially, the lady had predicted the end of World War I, the onset of World War II, and a failed assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II in 1981. The children were believed, though, by tens of thousands who came to join them as they prayed by this oak tree on the 13th of every month, when the lady would appear to the children. This went on until October, when she delivered a promised miracle as proof of her divinity. It wasn't until 1930 that the Vatican finally recognized the events as miracles. The basilica was consecrated in 1953, and in 2017, the 100th anniversary of the apparitions, Jacinta and Francisco, who had died from the 1918 global flu pandemic, were canonized as saints by Pope Francis. An estimated 1 million pilgrims packed the huge square with him for the ceremony. In 1928, Lucia became a nun and lived to age 97. She died in 2005, and the lengthy canonization process for her has been underway since 2008. Today, about 4 million faithful make the trek annually to Fatima. Many cover the final stretch, about 600 feet from the Basilica of the Most Holy Trinity to the Chapel of Apparitions, which is near the Great Basilica, on their knees, praying the rosary as they go, as an act of penance or as thanksgiving for requests fulfilled. In nearby Tumar, the Convent of Christ is a combination castle monastery. The Knights Templar, who had defended Portugal against the Moors, built their headquarters up on a hill on land a grateful Portuguese king had donated to them in 1160. The Knights were a military group of wealthy aristocrats organized by a French nobleman after the First Crusade, early in the 12th century. They saw themselves as warrior monks, tasked to protect Christian pilgrims making their way to and from Jerusalem, and as such were sanctioned by Pope Innocent II. They were given rights, power, tax exemptions, and they answered to no one except the Pope. They adopted a uniform of sorts, a white hooded cloak emblazoned with a red cross. They set up their own banking system, invested in land across Europe, and became enormously wealthy. Too much so. They were ultimately accused of corruption by a French king mistrustful of their growing importance, and Pope Clement V then disbanded the group in 1312. The Templar Order and its fortunes didn't disappear completely, though, and was essentially reincarnated a few years later as the Order of Christ under Portuguese King Denis I's rule. A century later, his descendant, Prince Henry the Navigator, became Grand Master of the Order and used its riches to fuel overseas expansion in the 15th and 16th centuries in what became known as the Age of Discovery. The powerful Portuguese fleet, recognizable by its white sails and signature bright red crosses, sailed the world over and made the country a powerhouse on the seas. For more about Henry and the explorers, you can check out my Lisbon show. Henry also initiated expansion of the Tomar complex, adding a palace and new cloisters. Remodeling continued over centuries and extensively under King Manuel I, the 16th century Grand Master. The entire 112-acre monument ensemble earned a spot in 1983 on UNESCO's list of World Heritage Sites, with high praise from the organization. Quote, the primitive church of the Templars, together with its constructions of the Renaissance, forms a masterpiece of human creative genius. A really stunning part of the complex is the original 12th century Templar church, which was likely inspired by the octagonal central building of Jerusalem's Temple of Solomon. Although referred to as a rotunda or a round church, that's not exactly correct. It is octagonal, supported by 8 pillars. In medieval Christianity, the number 4 and all its multiples had a sacred connotation. The number 8 was seen as an expression of perfection, balance, and rebirth. For example, it is said Jesus rose from the dead 8 days after entering Jerusalem. Or it could signify new beginnings, like that the 8th day was the first day after creation when God returned to work. While some of the country's churches and cathedrals do still hold services, many of them have been repurposed as museums or bought by private entities, who are then required to restore and maintain them. Quite a few are now among UNESCO's World Heritage Sites. One of the most unusual religious spaces can be found in Évora, the Chapel of the Bones at the Church of St. Francis. In the 16th century, there were almost 42 monastic cemeteries in the city, which took up too much valuable land. As a solution, the monks extracted bones from the ground and used them to build and decorate this chapel in what some would say is an artful arrangement. The monks' goal was to encourage reflection on the transitory nature of human life and to drive home the need to live as a good Christian. In case the message of human life's temporariness and fragility, sent by the more than 5,000 skulls and bones, somehow escaped some visitors, a lintel above the entryway spells it out quite clearly, saying, "We bones that are here, for yours we wait." More modern-day operators of the chapel have added a touch to lighten the mood a bit. A huge private collection of an Évora couple's nativity sets, reflecting the birth scene as depicted in countries around the world, including even the town's ancient Roman temple ruins. The granddaddy of them all is one that relocates the Christ birthplace to Évora and incorporates many sites within the city, with its 45 buildings, 564 clay human, animal, and other figures that comprise the scene, which is nearly 12 feet across and took over a year to complete. You may have heard the phrase, the gift that keeps on giving. Well, Óbidos has a different take on that. It is the town that kept getting given. First, it was King Alfonso II who gave it as a gift to his wife early in the 13th century. Then it was King Denis who, at the end of the century, gave the town as a wedding gift to his bride. By gifting the town, what a king essentially did was give his new wife an allowance. Taxes paid by the townspeople were the actual gift, money for her personal use only to spend any way she wanted. The queens, though, did take good care of their town and citizens, and today Obidos is considered the finest example of a walled medieval town. The castle dates back to Portugal's Roman occupation, and the mile-long wall is still largely intact and walkable. When the monarchy was abolished in 1910, the medieval castle came under the government's control and is now open to the public. The palace inside was sold in 1948 and turned into an upscale hotel. Normally, sleepy little Obidos is completely transformed in the spring when hundreds of thousands of tourists descend on it for a multi-day extravaganza that is near and dear to my heart. A foretaste of what's to come is hinted at in the courtyard of the Church of St. Mary, where sculptures of chocolates adorn the walls. The event? An international chocolate festival. For nearly 2 weeks, Obidos becomes the world's chocolate capital. The castle and town serve as a venue for all things chocolate, including tastings, workshops, sculptures, even things not ordinarily considered related to the confectionery. Like chocolate apparel, each year has a different theme, and everything from a parade through town to contests reflect that. In 2022, the 20th anniversary of the event, the topic was the Roaring Twenties and featured a replica of a 1920s Ford crafted from 800 pounds of chocolate, which took over 500 hours to complete. Other chocolate renderings featured Charlie Chaplin, as well as Disney characters. Unfortunately, I just missed the festival, which in 2023 ran from March 10th to the 26th. Over in Tumar, they have a colorful celebration of their own, the Festival of the Trays. An unusual silhouette of parading ladies welcomes visitors to the town. The summertime event features a parade of women with trays on their heads, although these can barely be seen atop the women since they are basically buried under 30 pounds of paper flowers, bread, and symbolic items. The resulting tower must be the same height as the woman who bears it. The festival has its roots in the late 13th century, when King Denis and his wife Isabel, who was later elevated to sainthood, established the carnival as a religious homage. These days, it is part of a series of celebrations around the Holy Spirit and takes place once every 4 years. In 2023, that was from July 1st to the 10th. From the festive to the dignified, we travel over to Coimbra, home to Portugal's oldest and most prestigious university. Coimbra shares a convoluted history with Lisbon. The first king of Lisbon, Alfonso Henrique, made Coimbra the fledgling country's capital back in 1139. That honor eventually went to Lisbon, nearly a century later. Conversely, Portugal's first university was founded in 1290 in Lisbon by King Denis, but spent time shifting back and forth with Coimbra for a few years until ultimately being moved permanently to Coimbra and taking up residence in the old palace. The university, one of the world's oldest, is highly regarded and often referred to as Portugal's Oxford, and obtaining a degree in Coimbra is viewed as a mark of prestige. Until the mid-16th century, it was the only operating university in Portugal. Early on, teaching was a religious vocation, and Coimbra was initially overseen by Jesuits with their long, dark cassocks. Students followed suit, and some today still wear the basic uniform of black pants or skirt, white shirt, and black cape. The common attire was codified in 1957 as a symbol of equality. It came to represent respect, humility, and fraternity. Seeing students so dressed around campus, you could be forgiven for thinking you'd wandered onto a film set for Harry Potter, and you would be correct to draw a correlation between the fictional Hogwarts and the Coimbra students. Author of the popular series of Young Wizards, J.K. Rowling, lived in Portugal when first drafting the tale, and although she has never been explicit about her inspiration for the cloaks, the similar look could hardly be entirely coincidental. The same could be said for a few other sites. including the university's library, which some compare to the Hogwarts Library. Both facilities have multiple floors, soaring ceilings, large arched windows, wood accents, and tens of thousands of books housed in old world charm. Coimber's one is decidedly more lavish, though. Named after King John V, who initiated construction in 1717, it features a remarkable central hall decorated with elaborate ceiling frescoes, silver inkwells, and exquisite reading tables inlaid with exotic South American woods. The library was as much a monument to Portugal's world status and its wealth as it was to higher learning. Towering shelves, magnificently gilded with gold from then colony Brazil, hold some 40,000 books dating back centuries and still available for a loan. Curiously, the library employs an unusual cleanup crew to protect the books. A group of about 20 bats that eat potentially harmful insects are unleashed each night. And then, over in Porto, where Rawling lived with her first husband, there is possibly her inspiration for the premium bookstore featured in the Potter series. While she was teaching English in town, she may have wandered into the Lello bookstore or glimpsed the striking interior through an open door, though she does not acknowledge doing so. The shop is arguably one of the most breathtaking spaces, with a look as far from a local Barnes & Noble as possible. Founded in 1906, Lello has been given the highest accolades from CNN, Time magazine, The Guardian newspaper, and even National Geographic. Lonely Planet described it as a pearl of Art Nouveau. A descendant of the founding Lello still sits on the business's board. A stunning mix of architectural styles, ornate woodwork, colorful 26-foot long by 11.5-foot wide stained glass skylight, and a magnificent set of stairs combined to make the price of admission worthwhile. In 2023, that was €5, but it was deducted if you made a book purchase. The entry fee was initiated, owners say, to both limit crowds of tourists in the small building as well as to promote reading. The standout crimson staircase, made of reinforced concrete and not wood, bears a remarkable resemblance to the elaborate grand staircase at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, known for its sudden changing configurations. The brilliant red brings a sharp contrast against all the browns, and was unintentional. During a 1993 renovation, the emblematic staircase was also brown, but a misunderstanding with the painter led to the bright red. When the renovation's master sculptor saw it, though, he was enchanted, and so it stayed. One fan describes Lello's atmosphere as rich and inviting, with a hint of the mysterious. It looks like a place where a story will unfold. The São Bento station, named after the 16th century Benedictine monastery that once stood there, is now a railway hub. Built in 1916 in Porto's city center, it is often described as one of the most beautiful train stations in the entire world. The artwork in its main entry hall is outstanding, to say the least. It took 11 years for the artist to tell key events of the country's history across its walls and ceiling, with about 22,000 painted tiles called azulos. These tiles are a prominent part of Portugal's landscape, and some buildings are covered entirely in them. There's even a national tile museum in Lisbon that traces the art form from the 15th century to present day, which of course you can learn more about in my Lisbon program. Nearby is another Porto cultural treasure, the Mercado de Bolio. An impressive neoclassic building rings the multi-floor open-air marketplace, which has roots back to the late 1830s. Taking up an entire city block, the nearly 54,000 square foot market was first opened to the public in 1914 and recently underwent a 4-year, €30 million renovation to modernize the venue. Although the building center is open to the sky, Pointed roofs protect the main floor vending area. The structure may have been updated, but the market has lost none of its historical significance. Whole generations of families have sold their goods at the same spaces as their ancestors. Baleo now has about 81 stalls, 38 stores, and 10 restaurants. There's fishmongers and butchers, greengrocers and florists, wine merchants, and even a knife sharpener. You won't find a more diverse array or fresher food anywhere in town. You can stop at any of the vendors and grab lunch and a glass of wine, maybe, to take over to a table area and enjoy your meal while people watching in the busy center. If you want to get really adventurous, you could try a uniquely Porto food, which could qualify as a food group all by itself. I just call it a calorie bomb. It's a massive combination of bread, various meats, cheese, a rich sauce which may include wine or other booze, and an egg topper. In case there's not enough carbs with just the sandwich alone for you, it is usually served surrounded by fries. While Porto may be best known these days as the birthplace of fictional Harry Potter, it is also the birthplace of someone much, much more important, Prince Henry the Navigator. Although not much of a sailor, legend holds he was prone to seasickness, he became known as the Navigator because he drew together maritime experts to design new ships, maps, and navigational instruments, and then organized and funded expeditions to Africa, Asia, and the Americas, making Portugal a global empire. The first stone for this monument in his honor was laid in March 1894, marking the 500th anniversary of Henry's birth in Porto. He stands tall with his arm pointing out to the Douro River and the Atlantic Ocean beyond, seemingly sending the Portuguese navigators off to claim land and riches across the world in his country's honor. The Douro River became an integral trade route and elevated Porto, the country's second largest city after Lisbon, to be considered the capital of Portugal's northern region. The waterway starts in Spain and flows 350 miles through Portugal on its way to the Atlantic. It forms a natural boundary between the two countries in places, and its lush river valley constitutes one of the oldest wine-producing regions on Earth, active for nearly 2,000 years. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Portuguese wines became especially important when Britain and France were at war and Britain had banned the import of French wines. Necessity may be the mother of invention. It can also be the impetus for finding alternative sources, and Portugal's unique fortified wine bubbled to the top. Brits decided they really liked the sweeter, richer, and heavier drink, and so got into business with Portuguese winemakers, whose fortifying process of prematurely stopping fermentation made it possible for the wine to maintain its quality on a long voyage. British businesses set up processing companies at the mouth of the Douro in Porto. Today, they also own most of the Douro wineries. After sailing from vineyards to Porto, the cargo is processed and then sent across the river to the Douro's north side and the cooler cellars of Porto's sister city, Via de Nova de Gaia. There it is aged before being exported. A little trivia. Port wine became known by the name of the district where it was processed, while the country took its name from the early Romans, who called the region Portus Calais, or warm port, which eventually became Portugal. Port wine production today is a top economic source in the Douro region, both in terms of wine exports and tourist visits to the beautiful area dubbed the Enchanted Valley. Thousands of large and small vintners line a 50-mile stretch of river, tending to approximately 110,000 acres of vineyards. In 1756, Portugal's Marquis de Pombal demarcated or set out strict rules for developing fortified sweet wine from the Douro region in order for it to be able to carry the port name, the first such designation in Europe. From that point on, true port wine, or Porto, can only be called that if it comes just from this region and follows specific regulations of production. just as champagne technically refers to wines only from a specific region of France. Port is just one of many varieties of wine created in the country. Portugal is in the top 5 wine producing countries in Europe. It's 11th in world production, despite its comparatively small landmass. According to the USDA, it annually exports more than 300 million liters, valued in excess of 900 million US dollars. A spectacular place to learn about other than port wine production is at Quinta de Aveleda in the town of Penafiel. Founded by Manuel Pedro Guedes about 150 years ago, the still family owned vineyard and gardens make for both an informative and transcendental experience. The family home is an iconic symbol of the estate with its walls covered in vines, and it is an architectural extravaganza. The award winning winery covers about 321 acres in the famed Vinho Verde region in northern Portugal. Quinta de Aveleda, about 20 miles east of Porto, is just one of the family's vineyards, which total more than 10,000 acres. They produce world famous white, red, and rosé wines. The grounds are a joy to explore. Delightful gardens cover about 20 acres at the Quinta. There's over 114 floral species and century-old trees, such as a Japanese cedar and a swamp cypress, and a unique collection of 94 species of camellias that paint the garden in pinkish and reddish tones during the spring blooming season. A lake is the perfect backdrop for a thatched tea house. And then there's the wildlife swans, chickens, geese, dogs, and more calling the grounds home. The goats even have their own winding 3-story stone tower to give them some climbing space, as well as lots of hay to frolic in. And my favorite, several peacocks wandering freely around the grounds, like this guy who I swear struck a pose just for me. With so much of the world's wines being produced in Portugal, it follows there's a huge market for cork stoppers. And fortunately for the little country, that's in ready supply as well. Portugal is currently considered the highest producer of cork in the world, having reclaimed the title briefly lost to Spain after fires early this century. It produces more than half the world's cork supply, about 310,000 tons a year. The $1.3 billion industry is an eco-wonder kind of sorts. It's an entirely sustainable material. The trees aren't cut down nor damaged when the cork is harvested every 9 years, starting when a tree is about 25 years old. The bark regrows, and a single cork oak, like this 90-year-old on a farm near Evora, can be harvested over 16 times during its lifespan, which is typically about 200 years. Even more interesting is just how versatile the material is. Of course, there's the wine bottle cork stoppers. On average, Portugal produces about 40 million each year. But that's just the start. The durable material is highly water repellent, so it can be used rain or shine. It is an organic, sustainable material, 100% vegan and eco-friendly, and it's easy to clean with just mild soap and water. It's also hypoallergenic, since it doesn't absorb water, dust, dirt, mold, or mildew, making it a valuable component in a whole host of goods. Cork is also good for sound and heat insulation, and is increasingly being used for soundproofing materials, for example, floor tiles, and even in the space industry. It's used as well for all kinds of accessories, such as handbags, purses, wallets, shoes, furniture, umbrellas, and even as a fashion statement. One Portuguese designer created this unique work of art, a dress that took 2 years to produce, and was worn by an equally distinctive woman for a dramatic effect, and as a nod to her Portuguese audience at a concert in 2014. None other than singer Lady Gaga, and she wore it well. I like to end all of the programs with the words of Dr. Seuss. Sometimes you don't appreciate the moment until it becomes a memory. And I like to add to that to always remember to celebrate the moments and treasure the memories. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of the central and northern sections of Portugal. If you'd like to learn more about the capital and history of the country, look for my Lisbon Bustling Beauty program. Should you have any questions about this presentation, email me or use the contact page on my website, which is also where you can visit any of my European or USA destinations. And don't forget to check my Programs tab to see flyers describing each of my programs, available in video format, in addition to a listing of which ones I'll be presenting in person and where. You should contact your library or community center to confirm which version they are making available. I also recommend you check out my Tips tab for the latest regulations kicking in for both domestic and international travel, especially for acceptable forms of identification and documents we will need to travel to the UK and EU countries. Obrigada, or thank you, for taking this journey with me.